So we're wrapping up a series of messages today that we've entitled Remain out of John chapter 15. So if you want to turn there, John chapter 15. As Jesus speaks to his closest disciples about the importance of remaining in him, the true vine, and remaining in his love. And each week we've held up verse 5 of this chapter as a theme verse, and by now it ought to be becoming more like a memory verse, I would think. But I want to hold it up one last time this week in this series. So Jesus' words to his disciples then and now. In verse 5, Jesus says, "I am the vine, and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing." Yeah, you can do nothing. Yeah, apart from Jesus, we can do nothing. And so what that means, church family, is that we're not going to put our confidence in ourselves to accomplish what God has called us to do, but rather we're going to put our confidence in the true vine, which is Jesus Christ our Lord. Now, that means our one job is to be the branch. And to be the branch, our one job is to stay connected to the vine, that no matter what, we must remain in that vine. For if a branch is no longer connected to the vine, it no longer is a branch. In fact, it becomes a stick, a dead stick that's only good for one purpose, and that's to be picked up and thrown into the fire, Jesus says. And so, true story. It's not good for anything, Jesus says, except to be picked up and thrown into the fire. Like, that's all it can do, okay? It's not connected to the vine. And so when we start to put confidence in ourselves and in our own efforts, on our own ideas, our own worthiness, it leaves us feeling frustrated, discouraged, and overwhelmed. And so we want to be reminded, especially I think in this season, that we are the branch, okay? And our one job is to stay connected to Jesus no matter what, and then we trust him for the production. So we talked about this in the second week, I think. It's connection first. And once there's connection, then there'll be production. For the fruit will come naturally because it comes from the vine. So now that sounds easy enough, right, church family? But the problem is staying connected is especially difficult when there's so much division in the world. Because what happens in a world that is divided, that's in chaos, is it becomes kind of tribal, okay, where people separate themselves into sides, and even when it seems like those sides shouldn't even be against each other, but they are. But because they have divided into these sides, into tribes, people want to put you in a category or another category, or on one side of the aisle or the other side of the aisle. Do you all see division in the world? Yeah, it's like out there, okay? It's pretty easy to see. Like you see it in politics. We see it in the news outlet that you get your news feed from. It shows up in our own lives. It has a tendency to. Like, where do you get your news from? It's a side. We see it with protests, and everyone wants to know, whose side are you on? Okay, whose side are you on? It's all about putting people on certain sides, and if you don't play nice and choose a side, like if you say you're not going to be on any one side, then you'll get blamed and shamed on the other side. And it's just very divisive time, and there are people getting offended everywhere you look, and you see this in all kinds of areas, and even some of the simplest things. Like, for instance, I thought about this week, and I've seen this happen. Say you have a group of people that are traveling together in a bus, okay? And it could be like a minibus, a minivan, like what we have where you put 12, 15 people in it. It could be a bigger bus, say, like that holds 40 people. But the time comes, you're taking a trip, and time is going to come where you're going to need gas, or someone's going to say, it's time for a break, okay? And invariably, someone who's a coffee drinker is going to say, let's look for an exit where there's a Starbucks because I haven't had my Starbucks since this morning. Okay? And no sooner will that person have spoken and someone else will speak up and say, no, not Starbucks, stop at McDonald's because their coffee tastes better and it's cheaper. And since we live in a somewhat, there's always going to be, some people think we live in a democracy. We really don't. But because we think we do, nonetheless, people are going to start declaring their allegiance to a side. Starbucks, McDonald's, And then to make matters worse, some independent person's going to speak up and declare, well, I really don't like coffee. I like hot chocolate and donuts. Can we look for a Dunkin' Donuts? And do you know what you do with those kind of people, church family? You kick them off the bus until they find Jesus, okay? Because clearly anyone who doesn't drink coffee needs Jesus, right? Now, I tell you that because it's only a little tribal, okay? It's like a little tribal illustration. It's true, mind you, but it's a little tribal, okay? And so that's all fun. But what's not fun is in this world, there are so many people that are so tribal just about everything. I mean, it's like on any given topic, two different sides will emerge, each with very different perspective, very different thoughts, and very different approaches. And we just live in a time where it feels like no matter which side you're on, it means that you're going to be against the other side, and it means that people who disagree with you somehow, they're going to be labeled with hate. They're going to label you with hate, okay? And I guess disagreement's not okay anymore. Like you can't, there's no such thing as tolerance anymore. We can agree to disagree. And so we just feel this tension in our world, I think, still, okay? It's not as bad as during the election in 2020 or during COVID. It was pretty intense then. But I think, back then, even the slightest indication that you were on a side might instantly be demonized by the other side, and then that might even get you canceled, from your side. And so it has eased, I think, some, but stick around. It's an election year, right? And what's funny, not really funny, but interesting, sometimes you hear Christians talk, and I'm pretty sure I've done this, okay? But they talk like Jesus is on their side, okay? Which isn't so surprising because during this country's civil war, didn't both sides, both the North and the South, have their own spiritual songs, like God's on our side, okay? And I'm pretty sure soldiers on both sides prayed for protection for their side and victory for their side. I mean, you ever wonder whose side God was on in that war? And I think today we often feel like we're living in the midst of a civil war and everyone's pressuring us. So whose side are you on? And so one of the questions that I know that many of us answer as you scroll through social media, throughout the week, or if you watch the news, is when you see an issue, you go, which side am I going to be on that one? Because there'll be sides, right? And as a result, what we're seeing is, even in our culture now, is where people lose friends because they've chosen to have a certain perspective that's different from their friends. And we're seeing where parents and children have stopped talking to each other because they're on separate sides of some political issue or some social issue. And so while it maybe has eased a little bit, we still kind of wrestle with this idea of what side am I going to be on? But here's what we're going to see as we finish up John chapter 15, and that is that Jesus is going to remind his followers that it's not about what side you choose, okay? Or you've chosen. It's not about that. But rather, it's about the fact that you've already been chosen. Right? That's the title of the message today. You've been chosen, okay? And this really, the fact that you've been chosen, it really makes a difference for us as we live out our faith in a very divided culture, because it's not about what side you choose, right? It's about the fact that you've already been chosen, okay? And you can write this down. For chosen people, don't get that caught up in choosing sides. I mean, chosen people just don't get all that caught up in choosing sides. I mean, here's what Jesus is saying to his closest followers. And if you're a follower of Jesus, which most of you are, if not all, it's like if you've already, it's like you've already chosen, like the choosing a side thing, it's already been done. Okay, if you're a follower, it's already been done because you've already been chosen, and that impacts how you live out your life in a very divided society in a very divided season. So here's what Jesus says in John chapter 15, verse 16 to his followers. He says, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit that will last." Did you hear that, Christ followers? Jesus says, you didn't choose him. He chose you. Okay? Jesus says, I chose you on purpose, and I appointed you to produce lasting fruit. So write this down. Jesus says, I choose you on purpose, and I choose you for a purpose. Okay? And I choose you on purpose and for a purpose to produce lasting fruit. And then in verse 16b, he says, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask for using my name. And then Jesus says this in verse 17. He says, this is my command. And this is like the root command, an absolute command. He says, love each other. Which goes right along with everything he'd been saying in previous verses. It's all about love. This is a huge message for some people who may be struggling with that ancient question of why am I here and what's my purpose in life? And if that's you and you've come into a season of life where you're just kind of lost and you don't really know, and you don't really know what you should be about in this particular season of your life, and you're not really sure how to make a difference because a lot of your plans have kind of gotten turned upside down, Jesus says, I have saved you on purpose for a purpose. And your purpose is to love others. And even if you're not lost in this season of life, it just serves like a really good reminder, because Jesus wants the disciples to understand always, okay, always. Don't ever forget this, because in this world there will come a time when you're going to feel rejected and you're going to feel opposed. So when that time comes, they will know that they have been chosen, okay? In other words, don't forget that you've been chosen, okay? And when other people reject you, don't forget that I'm the one who chose you. You've been chosen. Now, I'm not sure at this point, and this is a bad day to do it because we're kind of worn out today. But I'm not sure I've taught you anything new thus far, right? Especially with the weeks of many of you. I'm like, Jesus chose you, right? I mean, how many of you came here this morning and like, I knew Jesus chose me. That's nothing new. Yeah, okay, it's all right. You're not hurting my feelings. Like, kind of new, okay? Like he chose us. He adopted us. We just sang about it, right? He adopted us to be his children, okay? And as his children, he loves us, okay? So probably nothing new or confusing thus far this morning. But where I think Christian people even get confused is they think, okay, all right, so I'm a follower of Jesus, and that means Jesus has chosen me, so I'm on his side. But here's the question. What side is Jesus on? Right? What side is Jesus on? Okay. Now, as a minister, no one ever asked me this directly, but they kind of ask me in roundabout ways, one way or another. I get asked this question, and the question is, what? Like there's all this side stuff going on, and they want to know, what side is Jesus on? Okay. And it's like they know I'm never going to say up here on a Sunday morning, because it'll cause an uproar. Because even in here, we have people who sit on the left and people who sit on the right. And someone right now is going, Martha, I didn't know we were on the left or the right. We're moving to the other side next week. No, you won't. You've been sitting there for 100 years, so you're going to stay right there on that side. But yeah, that's what happens, okay? I'm not going to say, because it's going to cause an uproar, and someone on one side or the other is going to say, I'm not good with that. Truth is, just like in the Civil War, people always think God's on their side, right? Because their side in their eyes is right and just. And you'll hear Christians talk like this, like, I don't know how that guy could hold that view politically because he's a Christian. I don't get how he could do that. Which implies, because we all know Jesus is on our side. Isn't that what that applies? I don't know how they could have that view if they're with Jesus, because we all know Jesus is on this side. Right? But the question is he really on your side? What side is Jesus on? Would you like to hear, church family? I'll tell you, okay? Like, is Jesus on the side of the Republicans, or is he on the side of the Democrats? Is Jesus on the side of the police, or is he on the side of the protesters? Is he on the side of the McDonald's coffee drinkers, or is he with those Starbucks coffee snobs? Right? Yeah, I know. Now you know I'm on the other side, right? So, yeah. And so is he with CNN, or is he, watch Fox News, okay? What side's Jesus on? And here's the answer, church. Jesus is on Jesus' side, right? He's on Jesus' side, okay? Jesus is on his own side. He's on his own side, okay? And this is really hard for some of us, I think, because we want to take Jesus and we want to pull him onto our sides, and that's just not how it works, okay? And we see this, right? Don't get me wrong, I understand where this is coming from, but you hear people say, and you see people post this on social media, right? They say, we need Jesus back in our schools, and we need Jesus back in our communities, and we need Jesus back in our country. And here's the thing, if Jesus is in our hearts, isn't he already in our schools? And isn't he already in our community? And is he not already in our country? And if he's not, then maybe it's more of a heart problem than a school or community problem. I read this week in about a previous election in 2020. Until I read it, I'd never heard this. So maybe you have, maybe you haven't. 2020 presidential election, there's this thing going around on the internet where people were trying to get other people to write Jesus in as a write-in in the presidential election, okay? Like, vote for Jesus, okay? It was like a grassroots movement. I don't know how big it got. Several thousand, I think, where thousands of people agreed that they were all going to write Jesus in for president of the United States. Write in, vote for Jesus, okay? Problem, though, Jesus wasn't running for president. He wasn't running for president. Like, he's King of Kings already. It'd be like a step down, right? He's not really interested in that gig, I don't think. And listen, I get where that's coming from, and I can respect the people's heart there, because we all want to say, Jesus is on my side of all this, okay? And I guess what I would tell you is that this sides thing, it's not new for Jesus. Like, he's been in this spot before, right? Like, I mean, there is nothing new under the sun, the Bible says, and this is one of those things that's not new. Jesus dealt with this side thing during his ministry, okay? As people were constantly trying to pull him into their sides, okay? In fact, I would say that this is one of the reasons why people hated Jesus so much, and ultimately why they killed him, is that he just wouldn't choose a side. Okay, and so he even had a time where the people tried to force Jesus to be king. You know, he didn't say he wanted to be king, but they tried to force him into it, but he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't choose a side. And you had, even within the Jewish people, you had different political parties represented on how you should deal with the government at the time. And the government was the Roman Empire, and the Jews were being oppressed, by the Roman Empire, and they didn't like it, of course. And so there were a group of people that were part of a political party that was kind of a radical political party called the Zealots. Okay, and they believed that the government had overstepped their authority, and that the Roman occupation needed to be stopped no matter what it took. And so they were angry, and they were violent, and they would do things like, carry knives in their cloak and stab a Roman guard, and then disappear into the crowd. And their mentality, the Zealots' mentally, was, we're going to fight fire with fire. We're going to do whatever it takes. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and they were sure that God was on their side, and when the Messiah would come, they were sure he'd be on their side. So Jesus, if you're the Messiah, you must be on our side. But you had another party called the Essenes, and they had a different approach. They too saw the government's occupation and abuse, but they too saw the cultural divide of values and ethics. And so their solution to it all was not to fight, but rather just flee from it. Just get away from it, okay? And so they decided they were going to remove to remote areas, okay? And they were going to live out in the mountains, and so that's what they did. John the Baptist, Essene, grew up that way, okay? So they lived in the mountains, away from everything happening politically or socially, and they said, we're just not going to have anything to do with it, okay? We're just not going to get mixed up in it. And they thought that when Jesus came, or when the Messiah came, that he would want to be on their side, because they were so committed that they had withdrawn from the world, and so surely now Jesus is going to come and give them the keys to the kingdom. But what happened was Jesus came, and Jesus was on his own side. And then religiously, you had a group called the Pharisees, and they were really conservative and strict, and they wanted to make it all about the law and keeping the law. And then you had the Sadducees, and they were on a different side of the aisle, and they were more liberal and open, more of the aristocrat type. And they were both these parties were trying constantly to nail Jesus down. Which side are you on, Jesus? What side are you on? And he just wouldn't do it. I mean, they all pressured him, and he absolutely refused to take a side, which begs the question, why? I mean, was he afraid? No, he refused to join his side because he was on his own side. And he came to bring a kingdom. And so Jesus came, and he just didn't do things the way people thought he should. And as a result, he was opposed and he was rejected. So now he's talking to his followers, his closest disciples, and he's saying to them, look, you don't need to get involved on whose side you're on, because you're already on my side, okay? You've been chosen by me already. You're on my side. So stop being so preoccupied with what side of things you're going to be on down here. Just know that because you've been chosen by me, you're going to be hated. So this is what happens in John 15. Jesus talks to them in verses 14 through 7 about being chosen, and he uses some very affirming language, and we're going to look at it more in a minute. But let's not forget in verses 9 through 13 that Jesus repeats the word love like 8 times in 4 or 5 verses. He just encourages them. The most common phrase is just remain in my love. Just remain in my love. It's all about love, love, love. Like love 8 times in those few verses, okay? And then in verse 18, there's this big switch where he talks about the world, okay? Where he says, because you've been chosen by me, you're going to be rejected by others. And because you've been chosen by me, other people are going to reject you. And he uses the word hate like 7 times in 8 verses. The word hate here and there and everywhere. And he describes how disciples will be treated in the world. And that word hate is not like just a generic general expression like I hate Brussels sprouts. I don't like them, but, it's not very personal. It's not a personal thing between me and Brussels sprouts. But this, it's very personal. It's this idea that you've been extended yourself in love to someone and they just haven't treated you with indifference. They've ridiculed you and they've opposed you and they've rejected you. And Jesus said, yeah, you can expect that. A very personal hate. Why? Because I've chosen you. And because I've chosen you, you're going to have these times where none of the sides are going to accept you. Because they want you to be on their side. And if you don't do that, they'll reject you. So let's look at this, what Jesus says. Verses 18 and 19 of John 15, Jesus says, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as one of its own. As it is, though, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Now, we talked about this a little bit last week, briefly, but I said we revisit it and unpack it some more this week, and so let's do that. I'll unpack a little bit more. Jesus said, if the world hates you, and this word if is not really if, it's more like when. So it's more like when it happens, and it doesn't happen all the time. It's not that people won't ever like you, but when it happens, when the world hates you, and I think sometimes we have this idea that if we just don't say anything, if we just remain quiet, that if you don't publicly take a side, that the world will like you, that the world will love you. Listen, you can't be in Jesus and remain in Jesus and appease the world. It won't work, okay? It won't, unless you side with the world. Okay, if you don't side with the world, there's no appeasing the world. You side with them, and Jesus says the world will love you. You take their side, the world will love you. That's why Jesus said, look, if the world hates you, or when it hates you, by the way, this all means if you're living a life in such a way that nobody ever bothers you, you might be doing it wrong, right? You might be doing it wrong. And so Jesus says, when the world hates you, remember that it hated me first. So bottom line, the world would love you as one of its own if you belong to it. If you would just choose their side, the world would love you as one of their own if you would choose the world, but you are no longer part of the world. For I have chosen you out of the world, so now the world doesn't know what to do with you, and in the end, it's going to hate you. So just know that up front, all because you've been chosen, you will be rejected. So, what are we to make of all this, in our world, okay? What does this have to do with us? Well, Jesus makes some things clear to his followers. He has told them that trouble is coming and that people aren't always going to like them. And when trouble comes, you are to remember two things. Like when trouble comes, when people reject you, that they are to remember, that you are to remember that you've been chosen on purpose and you've been chosen for a purpose. And you've been chosen on purpose and for a purpose. And listen, friends, this has incredible power, I think, if we understand it. When you really understand and believe the significance of this, it has power. That Jesus has chosen you on purpose, like it's not an accident that you're sitting here this morning, right? You're here because he chose you. Okay? And it's not an accident that he has called your name and you have responded. Now, you had to respond, but you did. But he called you first, right? And for the Word of God says you have been chosen on purpose. Then, when you get that, when you know that you've been chosen by Jesus, man, it gives you so much more confidence and courage than in uncertain times, okay? Jesus says, look, it's not that you chose me. No. He said, I've chosen you. And there's a difference, right? There's a difference. This is like the difference between applying for a job and getting recruited for a job, right? Like if you've ever been recruited for a job, you know this already. But when someone recruits you, what that means is you've been chosen for it, okay? Right? You've been chosen. And so since you've been chosen, you have a purpose, all right? Because what recruited says is that whoever they is that recruited you, they saw something in you and they wanted you for this role or for this position. So they recruited you, okay? And that's way better than applying, okay? So when that happens, if you're chosen, then there's a confidence that comes along with that, right? Let me give you an example to illustrate this. I've run this by my wife, and many times over the past. We're going to celebrate our 43rd wedding anniversary, Lord willing, this spring, okay? And most of you know this because I've told this story before, but somehow this all came about, us being who we are, married, and 43 years, all came about, you could call it chaste, you could call it pursued, but Margie stalked me. Okay. She stalked me. Okay. Now, ladies, I know you'd maybe prefer, I could say I had, this secret admirer, but that would make you upset too. So anyway, she stalked me. Not a lot, but a little. And it wasn't like in a creepy way. How she stalked me, we worked in for the same company, a financial services company, and she worked in the office, and I worked out in the field. And there was like a wall that separated office people from field people, but she was on this side of the wall, and I was on this side of the wall. But she worked in the office, and before I could choose her, she chose me. And the way she did is she began putting little cute notes. I'm not going to tell you what they said because they're embarrassing. But the cute little notes in my company mailbox, but she never signed her name, okay? And it was kind of, I knew I was being stalked, but it was kind of nice. Okay, because I knew I had been chosen, chosen to be stalked, but yeah, chosen nonetheless. And so I thought, this is a good thing. Anyway, this went on for a while. And then one day while in my hometown, I was playing a fast-pitch softball league. And just as I was warming up before a game, this young woman came riding in on a motorcycle that she kind of caught my eye. Okay, we were warming up, and I saw her, okay? And when she took off her helmet, it was Margie. And now I knew who chose me, okay? And stalked me, okay? And because I knew I was chosen, there was a confidence within me. And I said to myself, whoa, would you look at her motorcycle mama? I'm going to marry her. Now, you've all heard that story before, yes? Let me tell you the part you don't know. Okay, the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey said, you haven't heard this, most of you anyway. For on that same motorcycle was another young woman from that office, okay? Or should I say another young single woman from that office, which kind of complicated things because now I didn't know if it was Margie who had chosen me or the other young woman who had chosen me. So bottom line, I had to make my own choice, and I chose Margie. And the rest is history, 43 years. The truth of the story is we both chose each other. But to be clear, she chose me first. Okay? And in a world where there is so much anxiety, hey, that's my Valentine's story of the week, so, that's as good as it's going to get. And, for a love story, okay, that's as good as it's going to get here, okay? But anyway, in a world where there is so much anxiety and so much tension over finding your significant other, like, if I ask her out, is she going to say yes? Does she like me? Or is he going to call me again? There's a lot of tension over that whole thing. And listen, friends, it's just so much easier when you already know you've been chosen, right? So Jesus says, you have been chosen. He chose you. And it wasn't because you were the best of them, okay? It wasn't because you earned it or because you deserved it. Like, we tend to equate chosen with being qualified. Like, okay, maybe he chooses me because I'm smart enough or I'm athletic enough or I'm whatever enough, that's how the world works. Like, thank God that that's not how he works, right? Because none of us would get chosen, okay? But no, the gospel would teach us that it's not because we're good enough, but because God is gracious enough that we have been chosen. What's that mean? Well, it means there's no room for pride. Didn't have anything to do with you, right? We don't have any room for pride because he didn't choose us because we deserved it. But it also means that there's no reason for insecurity. Okay, no reason for pride, but no reason for insecurity. If Jesus would choose you based on your credentials, okay, or somehow your religious resume, then what happens when you have a bad day? What happens when you have a bad game? Suddenly, you're worrying about whether you're going to get cut from the team. But the Bible says it's not because we've earned it or deserved it. It's because of God's grace. I'm just telling you, there's so much freedom and understanding that we've been chosen by his grace, right? And so Jesus wanted his disciples to not forget that what this relationship that he has with him is all about. And it's one where we didn't choose him, but rather he chose us. And listen, this way of thinking, and I know you're probably going like, this sounds all backwards, okay? It's because it is, okay? The way the world thinks, is completely upside down from the way Jesus thinks. The way the world does things, it just doesn't do it this way. Think about it. In this world, if you want to be chosen, you fill out an application, right? You want a job, you fill out an application, or you give your potential employer your resume with a list of qualifications. In this world, if you want to go to a certain college or a certain school, you fill out an application and you list your qualifications. It was that way in Jesus' day too. Okay, I mean, Jesus was a rabbi, okay, and rabbis in Jesus' day, to take on a student or a disciple, they chose, like people applied, students applied, and they chose the best students, and they chose from those who were most qualified. Jesus didn't do it that way. Rather than taking an application, he just chose and issued an invitation. So write this down. Because Jesus doesn't accept applications, he offers invitations. And this, because he does, changes how we relate to him. Because some folks have this idea that every week when they come into church, it's like they're reapplying for a job, And the question you have in your mind is, well, were you good enough this week? I mean, did you make the cut to play on the team this next week, okay? And what we see with Jesus is he's the one who not by your deeds chooses. Okay, he chooses by his grace, not by your deeds, but by his grace. And this is so significant because in those days, a rabbi wouldn't ever humble himself by offering an invitation. We had a tennis pro one time that, he would never ask anybody to be a student. You had to come ask him, right? And that's how rabbis were. They wouldn't ever humble themselves by offering an invitation. A rabbi certainly wouldn't chase after, pursue, or stalk. The way you knew the status of a rabbi was by how many people pursued the rabbi. A lot of people pursue that rabbi. He's a big name, So Jesus is the one chasing, though, Yeah, and you know this, right? Because some of you especially know this because he chased you down. He's the one who initiated, he's the one who reached out, he's the one who invited, and he doesn't want you to forget that. Because when you feel rejected by others, and you will be, okay, he wants you to know beyond the shadow of a doubt that he has chosen you. And so one of the things that should happen then, and I have a couple of these things, but the first thing I want you to jot down is because we aren't insecure about our position with him, is that being chosen should give us unity amongst each other, right? Because we've been chosen not on merit, but by grace, we should have unity among each other, meaning none of this is a competition. There's not a ranking ladder around here. There's not a ranking ladder where you move up and down, on the scale. It's like 1, 2, 3. We see this in college rankings, and there's no ranking scale. There's not a list of current standings because there's not one person in this room that's somehow more deserving than another, somehow more worthy to be chosen than anyone else. There's not one person because we're all on the same ground, and that ground is called the foot of the cross. Ground's level there, right? The second thing I'd have you jot down, because you haven't been chosen for a purpose, or you've been chosen for a purpose and on purpose, you shouldn't be easily offended, okay? In other words, people chosen means you shouldn't be easily offended, okay? This is all about where you find your significance, right? You ever think about that? Where do I find my significance? A lot of people find it through their work or some other thing, sport they play or whatever. Where do you find your significance? And the point is, if you know what Jesus has said about you, then who cares? Who cares really what other people might say or think about you? And if you're someone who finds your significance in pleasing people, oh man, put that burden down and be set free. For Jesus says in chapter 15, verse 15, if you're one of them, you highlight this verse 15. It says, I no longer call you servants because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I call you friends. Friends. You hear that, church? Jesus has called you his friend. And that makes all the difference in how we process, hurt and offense. As you read the Gospels, you ever notice how Jesus seems to never get offended over something said about him? Never. Okay. Now, he gets offended by how people treat his Father's house, and he gets more than a little excited when he sees lowly people being taken advantage of. but he never gets offended, when the offensive aim their attack on him. He just does not, okay? And this is one of the reasons why Jesus was so unoffendable, I think, is it's because he knew who he was and whose he was, and he knew what he had come to do, and that's all he cared about, okay? And it didn't really matter what anybody else said or did to him, and so you just could not offend him. And he didn't go on Facebook and rant, and he didn't have a Twitter fit, because that's just not who he was, because he knew who he was. And because we have been chosen, because we've been called a friend of Jesus, we know who we are. And that should make it so difficult for people to, easily offend us. And so Jesus says to his followers in verse 16, you didn't choose me, I chose you. I chose you on purpose and for a purpose, and I appointed you to go and produce lasting fruit. And then Jesus says, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask for using my name. So listen, you've been chosen. You've been appointed, you've been given a mission to bear fruit, and as you produce this fruit, God will give you whatever you need, right? He's all about, I'll do that. Yeah, because apart from him, you can do what, church? So we're going to depend on him, right? And so it begs the question, how do we do that? Well, it all begins with prayer, okay? We ask God for help as we fulfill the purpose that he's given us. That means, that's what it means to remain, okay? At least that's the beginning of remain. And we remain by praying. To pray is to remain in the vine. It's to remain in his love. It's what it is to be the branch. We stay through prayer connected to the vine, and the vine gives us everything we need to do everything he's called us to do. Now, when I said earlier, he gives us everything, that's not like a Christmas wish list, right? He gives us everything we need to do what he's called us to do. Last Sunday, we began a journey as a church where we said we're going to pray through the month of February, and many, if not most of you, jumped in, and we've been praying as a church family this past week that the fruit of the Spirit would kind of flow through us into the world, and so we've been praying overall for unity over division, but also where we find hate, we pray that love would grow through it. Our love would grow through it. When we find anger in the world, our joy would grow through it. And where we find anxiety and depression, we grow in peace, even in the midst of it. And when we encounter a world that's so easily annoyed and offended, we grow patience through it, And when we find ourselves in a world that is cruel and harsh, by the fruit of the Spirit, we show kindness. And by the fruit of the Spirit, we grow gentleness in a world that can be kind of demanding and violent. And by the Spirit, we'll grow in our self-control, even in the midst of such chaos and conflict. And so together we grow deeper. And if you have jumped in on this in the United Prayer, we're going to continue this, or even if you haven't, you can still join us. We're going to pray until the end of this month, praying for unity over division, because with God through the vine, we can bear much fruit. But without the true vine, we can do what, church? Nothing. So we're asking God to do what no other side could do, right? I mean, we could choose other sides, but this would never happen. This would never happen. So during your prayer time, one time each day, ask God to do what we can't do, to bring healing, to bring hope to our country, to our communities, and to bring unity over division. And to be more precise, what we're praying for is revival in our communities and in our nation and in our churches, right? And we're praying that God would draw people to himself through us, one person at a time. So listen, church, do we understand we have been called for a purpose? And the way that we live out that purpose is by being in constant prayer, asking God for help along the way. Each day, pray without ceasing. And then Jesus says that part of the purpose, and we find it in verse 17, is, and this is kind of like the big command, to love each other. To love each other. And Jesus says it like this. He says, this is my command, love one another. It's not a suggestion, right? It's a command. And the only way we can do that is through the vine. So that's what we want to be. That's what it means to remain. We want to be the branches living the branch life where we love one another. And all God's people said, let's pray that it might be so.